All right. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope that you all had a nice weekend and that you're continuing to take care of yourselves and manage everything in this very chaotic and confusing time. Um, this video in particular is going to be about the idea of synthesis and stakeholders, and it's going to build on what we were working on last week with inquiry questions. So my hope is that everyone has kind of started to really think more specifically about a topic that they want to research. Again, there are several in the research bank that you can choose from, and if you want to do something different, my recommendation is just that you email me and let me know so that I can make sure that it's one that will allow you to be successful with this upcoming assignment. And I have this slide up here because I just think it gives you a little bit of a reminder of where we're headed ultimately. I'm not going to run through it because I did that in our last presentation. But in general, one of the things that you want to be focusing on and really trying to nail down within the next few days is your inquiry question. So we talked last class about how to kind of refine that question and to make sure that it's a question that allows for multiple answers and also a question that is specific. That is something that you want to try to nail down by the middle of this week at the very latest. And based on what I'm seeing in your discussion posts, many of you are doing a really nice job of keeping things relatively specific, and I think that the research bank has hopefully helped with that because those issues are relatively specific. One thing that I want you to also be thinking about as you're tweaking that question, and don't be afraid to revise it as you go because it's something that should change a bit based on the research that you end up finding. But one thing I want you to think about is questions that not only invite multiple answers, but also invite in multiple perspectives. So for instance, if I wanted to ask an inquiry question about mental health, I could ask the question, what kind of resources are available for students who struggle with mental health issues? And while that might invite in different answers because there are multiple resources, it doesn't necessarily invite in multiple perspectives. The answer is objective. I can just basically answer it by looking up a list of different resources, right? But if I were to shift that question a little bit to the question, what should or could the university do to better support students who struggle with mental health? Okay, now I have a question that invites in multiple perspectives because different groups are going to answer that question differently, right? The same with this question about first generation students. What resources are available to assist first generation students? That's kind of an objective answer, right? You could easily do some research and find a list of these kinds of resources. However, if you were to shift that question just a little bit to what steps should first generation students take to ensure that they are prepared to meet the challenges of their first semester, now you have different potential answers to this question, right? So administrators might answer this one way, teachers might answer this another way. And so you can kind of pull together these different perspectives when you're writing your editorial, which is what we're going to be talking about now as we move into this concept of synthesis. So the idea of synthesis is going to be really important for your editorial because you will be using it. You will be synthesizing multiple sources. So it's important that we understand what we mean when we use this word, synthesis or synthesize. And synthesis, by definition, is something that is made by combining different things, such as ideas and styles. So the definition itself is pretty, I think, generally easy to understand. But it's important that we also understand what this looks like in writing. So I have a little bit of a visual here for you just to kind of see, so you can see, what you're doing when you're synthesizing. You're gathering different sources, and oftentimes these sources represent different perspectives on a topic. and combining them with your own ideas in order to create a new text, right? Which uses both the ideas of others and your ideas. And there are a couple of important things to understand here. The first is that we've been working on this in certain ways throughout the semester. So one of the things that you're going to really need to do well here is make sure that you're closely reading the sources so that you're able to accurately represent them in your text. Otherwise, your text becomes not credible because you're misrepresenting sources. So this is something that we have been doing in every single assignment. There's been some sort of element of summarizing. The other thing that is important to remember is that when you're finding sources, you want to make sure that you're representing ideas that are different in some way, right? So you want to make sure you're not finding 3 different sources that are saying the exact same thing. I really think that the best way to demonstrate this is to look at the discussion post that we engaged in a week or so ago when we looked at the different sources and compared them to Mediated Reality article. So I'm going to take us there so that we can kind of see how what you were working with a couple of weeks ago is a really strong example of synthesis. Just as a reminder of what we did, not last week, but the week before, is I had everyone read a specific article, summarize it, read each other's summaries, and then make some comparisons. After I had everyone do that, I had you all read the this article, Mediated Reality is No Match for Personal Experience. And then make some connections between this article and the article that you read and your peers' summaries. So hopefully what you were able to see is that this article used all of the articles that I had you read, right? So this article is a really awesome example of synthesis, right? Because it is pulling from different sources, but all of these sources ultimately say different things. However, the author is synthesizing these different ideas in order to support their own argument. So initially here, the author is using a claim made by Barack Obama about whether or not we are divided as a country, and kind of a refutation to that claim, and just kind of to open up this question of how divided or connected are we, and also how do we even determine an answer to that question. Further on, he provides some evidence based on a theory by George Gerbner called cultivation theory, which claims that we are very much influenced by media, right? So he's pulling from that particular theory to introduce this idea of being influenced by the media. And then kind of showing the ways in which the media could potentially be influencing our thoughts, right? And ultimately, the thesis is that we, when we have lived experiences with marginalized groups, we tend to revert to that rather than to use what we understand from the media. However, if we don't have that personal experience with marginalized groups, we're more likely to use our whatever we see in the media to support our beliefs about certain groups, right? So he uses different examples of the way that these groups are represented in the media, as well as some kind of examples of ways that the media can positively impact how we understand these groups to ultimately support his thesis. So as you begin to gather sources, this is something that I want you to potentially refer back to as an example. in that when you're looking for sources, you want to make sure you're pulling different ideas and different perspectives that could potentially support your ideas in different ways. So to begin, you might really look into different perspectives on your problem and on the problem and issue that you're looking at. There might be evidence that supports the status quo of the issue, like what is the problem? What are the statistics surrounding that problem? There might also be evidence that supports the impact of that problem and why it's something that we definitely need to address, right? And ultimately, you'll also be looking for research that supports whatever solution you're kind of proposing or whatever it is that you are arguing for at the end of your editorial. So again, synthesis is the combining of different ideas to create kind of a new text or a new piece of writing, and this is what you'll be doing as you move into the writing of your editorial, but you also want to be thinking about it as you're doing your research. All right, so now that we have defined synthesis, the other term that I really want to make sure we're all familiar with is stakeholder. And this is something that we've definitely referenced in class before, particularly when we were looking at how to identify an intended audience. But I don't know if we ever specifically nailed it down. So the definition of a stakeholder, pretty straightforward: a person, organization, institution, etc., that has a vested interest in an issue because they have something at stake, right? They have something to gain or lose. So while we might have individuals that are interested in an issue, that might not always be the same thing as a stakeholder, someone who actually has something at stake, right? And one of the things you want to be doing as you are narrowing your inquiry question is thinking about who the stakeholders in your topic are. And one of the reasons that you'll want to do this is because by identifying stakeholders, you'll have a better sense of how broad or narrow your question is, and if you need to broaden it further or focus it further. So if you're having a hard time figuring out who those stakeholders are, this might be because your question isn't specific enough, right? So if I were to ask a really broad question, like how effectively is the university using tuition dollars, it becomes a little bit harder to figure out who those stakeholders are. And even when we do figure out who those stakeholders are, they're still broad stakeholders, right? So I could identify parents, I could identify the administration, I could identify students, right? But the specific organizations and branches and groups, it's really hard to pin those down. However, if I were to change my question to something a little bit more specific, like how much funding should the university be allocating to sports programs, all of a sudden then I have some groups that are a lot more specific, right? It's much easier for me to identify the values and potentially assumptions of the sports program at CSU or the coaches at CSU than it is for me to identify a broader group like CSU administration, right? Because then there's going to be so many different perspectives wrapped up in that. So those are the things that you want to be thinking about as you're kind of figuring out how to narrow or shift or revise your inquiry question. Okay, and in the next video that I publish, we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of the synthesis grid, which is a process tool that will help you keep track of your sources. But in the meantime, what I'd like you to be doing is refining that question and then beginning to gather sources. So just a couple of things to pay attention to. You can use sources from the research bank. You can use sources from the CSU database, and you can use sources from the list on Canvas. And then we'll talk a little bit more in the next video about how to evaluate for credibility, and then there can be more freedom at that point. But for now, this is where you want to look for sources.